the night the sky broke open above the Pacific. The young American pilot never imagined the man poised to kill him would one day become his brother. Clouds rolled across the moon like torn fabric, and the sea beneath seemed bottomless, swallowing the reflections of distant fires from ships beyond the horizon. The pilot's name was Thomas Hale, 23 years old. Trained to strike with precision, but still carrying the trembling heart of someone who had not yet accepted that war demanded the quiet surrender of innocence. His B-29 had been returning from a reconnaissance sweep, a mission that intelligence officers insisted was routine but that pilots whispered about in dim, barracksan operation tied to secret assessments of Japanese air patterns, encrypted communications, and shadow plans for raids the public never learned even decades later. Somewhere between the Black Sea and the lightning-torn clouds, Hale's aircraft took a hit from an unregistered anti-air battery, the kind installed only in the most clandestine island outposts, used for listening posts that intercepted American radio traffic. Flames crawled across the wing. He knew they weren't making it home. The explosion buckled the fuselage, and the cabin filled with smoke thick enough to erase the world. He bailed out into the void, feeling the slap of the wind, the weightless dread of those seconds in which a man is no longer part of the earth. The parachute opened with a staggering jerk. Below him, the island was a fist of darkness in the sea. He didn't know its name, didn't know it housed a hidden Japanese unit running counterintelligence operations, men trained not just to fight but to decipher American habits, map patterns of thought, predict reactions. His landing was violent, bones jarring as he hit the trees. He lay there in the dirt, gasping, listening to footsteps approaching through the foliage. Every instinct told him those steps belonged to the enemy, who would either capture him or end him on the spot. But fate has a way of slipping through cracks humans cannot predict. The man who approached him, lantern trembling in his hand, was Lieutenant Sato Masaru, a fighter pilot grounded after an engine malfunction, but assigned to the island's covert research post. He stood over the fallen American, blade drawn, and in that suspended moment, the world narrowed to two sets of eyes, one frightened, one hardened by duty, but not consumed by it. Hale expected death, but instead the man lowered the blade. Perhaps he saw the fire still clinging to the sky behind the falling wreckage. Perhaps he saw a wounded boy and not an enemy invader. Perhaps he was already weary of the war that had stolen too much. Sato signaled for Hale to stay silent, then guided him deeper into the forest. Away from the patrols whose orders were simple: find the pilot and execute him immediately, hidden among massive roots of a banyan tree. Sato wrapped Hale's bleeding arm with cloth torn from his own uniform. Their breaths were the only sounds. And in those muted minutes, Hale realized something strange. Sato was shielding him, not out of strategy, but defiance. This island, as Hale later learned, housed civilians the Japanese military claimed had been evacuated. But they were here, forced to support radio outposts that intercepted American fleet codes. Sato, unlike many officers, had been quietly aiding them with extra rations, risking his career and life. Saving an American might have been a final act of rebellion, or maybe the beginning of a belief that humanity might still rise above the machinery of war. Hale drifted in and out of consciousness over the next day. Sato hid him inside a cave where Japanese soldiers stored tools and scraps of equipment. Hale slowly regained enough strength to understand where he was. He tried to speak. Sato pressed a hand over his mouth and whispered a warning the island's commanding officer. Colonel Jinbara was notorious even among Japanese ranks. Jinbara had been involved in secret psychological conditioning programs in Manchuria, efforts designed to break prisoners and extract information through methods officially denied after the war. Hale realized that if Jinbara found him, he would not simply be killed. He would be dissected through interrogation. It's a specimen of American strategy. At night, Sato brought him water and small amounts of food, risking everything. Hale watched the man's face under the lantern, glow-worn, sleepless, carrying a quiet storm. Sometimes Sato stared out of the cave as if reading invisible lines written on the wind. Something haunted him. Only much later did Hal discover that Sato's younger brother had died during secret kamikaze training, a program forced on boys as young as 17. fueled by propaganda films and pamphlets that promised glory but delivered only death. Sato believed the war had stolen the boy's mind before taking his body. Saving Hale was, in a way, saving someone else he had lost. One night the island shook with distant detonations, American destroyers sweeping the region, launching shells at outposts identified through decrypted communications. Hola didn't know it then, but these attacks were part of an operation previously sealed in military archives. Operation Viper Net. American intelligence had cracked portions of Japanese naval ciphers, and the first targets were the Shadow Islands used as signal relays. The Japanese soldiers on this island had no idea their transmissions were compromised. They believed the Americans were blindly searching. As shells lit the horizon with fiery arcs, Hale realized rescue might come, but at the cost of Sato's life. The next morning brought chaos. Patrols discovered parachute remnants near the southern ridge. Ginbera personally ordered a sweep, barking commands as if conducting a ritual. Sato returned to the cave, urgency in his eyes, whispering that he could no longer hide Hale. The soldiers were too close. Hale expected Sato to turn him in to save himself, but instead Sato pressed a folded map into his hand-to-hand-drawn guide to the shoreline where Hale might signal American boats if they passed. Hale studied the trembling lines, the landmarks sketched in haste. When he looked up, Sato's expression carried a weight heavier than fear. He whispered that he had once dreamed of flying beyond the war, beyond duty. Beyond the cage of propaganda, they moved through the forest together in shadows, stepping between shafts of light like ghosts. At one point they crouched as patrols passed meters away. Hale could hear the clatter of rifles, the murmur of men, already preparing for the kill they were certain awaited them. Hale and Sato remained still for what felt like hours. When at last the patrol moved on, Sato guided Hale again, deeper into a ravine. But before they reached the shoreline, a shout cracked through the air. A Japanese guard had spotted them, firing shots that shattered branches and tore through the undergrowth. Sato returned fire, not at the guard, but into the air-warning shots to draw attention away from Hale's hiding direction. Hale sprinted, heart pounding, until the forest thinned and the sea appeared like a sheet of hammered steel. American ships weren't near enough for rescue. Hale was trapped. Behind him, he heard shout Sato's voice among them, then gunfire. He turned, but the entire forest seemed to sway with violence. Hale crawled behind a rock formation and waited as the sun dipped. Hours passed before silence fell. He never saw Sato emerge. Eventually, he was found by American scouts after another bombing run temporarily weakened Japanese defenses. They pulled him into a landing craft. But his mind was still in the forest, replaying gunshots, wondering if Sato had survived or if his act of mercy had become his execution. Back in the States, Hale recovered physically, but carried the ghost of the man who spared him. He tried to explain to intelligence officers that Sato had saved him. They dismissed it as shock-induced confusion. Stories of honorable enemies did not fit the wartime narrative. The files on the island operations were sealed, buried in classified archives labeled psychological risk, potential morale impact. Hale learned that Sato's unit was presumed annihilated when American forces eventually took the island. No bodies were individually identified. The war moved on, and Hale was expected to do the same. But memories have their own gravity. They cling, resurface, demand answers. After the war, Hale lived with the quiet ache of unfinished truth. He married, raised children, worked in aviation, but at night, he still heard the gunshots in the ravine, still saw Sato lowering the blade, still wondered if the man who saved him had met his end because of that choice. For decades, he tried to access the classified records of Operation Viper Net, requesting files under early declassification initiatives. But each time the documents returned heavily redacted or missing entirely. It wasn't until the 1970s, as the government loosened secrecy around Pacific intelligence operations, that Hale found fragments hinting that survivors from the island had been taken prisoner and relocated. The records mentioned only ranks, not names, but one detail caught Hale's breath. A pilot with a damaged right wristband injury, Sato, mentioned in passing, had been among those transported. This small clue ignited a fire that had dimmed for 30 years. Hal spent the next decade writing letters, visiting archives, speaking with veterans and historians. He traveled to Japan in the mid-1980s, walking through memorials, searching records in dusty community centers. The quest felt impossible, almost obsessive. But he kept going because the truth felt like a debt he owed to a man who had chosen humanity over war. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, Sato Masaru lived in quiet anonymity, working as a mechanic in a rural town, carrying his own ghosts. The years had carved deep lines into his face, but the memory of the American pilot he saved never left him. He wondered whether Hale had survived, whether his sacrifice had mattered. Yet he kept silent, believing the world had no place for stories of mercy and war. Many Japanese veterans were encouraged to bury their past, to avoid speaking of operations tied to secret programs or failures. Sato believed no one would understand why he had spared the enemy. Fate intervened in the form of a historian researching psychological warfare during the Pacific conflict. He had interviewed Hale during a symposium and later stumbled upon a Japanese article mentioning a pilot who had refused to carry out lethal orders on an island outpost. The description matched the timeline and location. He contacted Hale, who traveled back to Japan with a mixture of hope and fear that bordered on prayer. When Hale first saw Sato in a small community hall, the world seemed to tilt. Sato stood slowly, eyes searching the face he had last seen, covered in sweat and dirt in a burning forest. Hale didn't speak at first. He simply stepped forward and bowed deeply, the gesture of gratitude he felt no words could hold. Sato bowed in return, tears gathering in eyes that had seen too much loss to cry easily anymore. In that moment, they were not former enemies. They were men bound by a single choice, made in the darkest of times. Their conversations stretched late into the night. Hale learned that Sato had been imprisoned after the island fell, surviving harsh conditions before being released at the war's end. Sato learned that Hale had spent 40 years wondering about his fate. They spoke not just about the war, but about the stolen years, the memories they could not share with their families, the secrets they had carried alone. Hale confessed that every time he watched a sunrise after the war, he wondered if Sato had lived to see one too. Sato admitted he often looked at the sky the same way as their reunion became known. Journalists approached them, but they resisted turning their story into a spectacle. They wanted it to remain a quiet testament to the complexity of human choices. Still, historians insisted on recording their account because it revealed truths long hidden. How secret outposts manipulated radio traffic, how psychological warfare corrupted logic, how acts of mercy survived even under command, structures designed to extinguish compassion. When Hale returned to the island years later, this time with Sato, the forest had reclaimed most traces of war. Rusted artillery lay half-buried, and vines curled around concrete ruins. Sato walked ahead, touching tree trunks as though greeting old companions. He stopped at the ravine, where he had fired warning shots, where he had last seen Hale disappearing toward the sea. The silence there was deep, almost sacred. Hal placed a hand on Sato's shoulder, and the two men stood wordlessly, listening to the wind move through leaves that had once shaken under gunfire. Their bond grew in the years that followed. Hale's children came to call Sato uncle. Sato introduced Hale to the rituals of his hometown, including the Lantern Festival, where families honor spirits of ancestors. Hale lit a lantern for Sato's brother, whispering a prayer for a boy he had never known but whose death had shaped the choice that saved him. Sato lit a lantern for the crew of Hale's B-29, acknowledging that war had wounded both sides in ways civilians rarely understood. The story of Hale and Sato became an emblem in academic circles studying ethical anomalies in wartime behavior, the rare instances where individuals defied systems engineered to crush empathy. Scholars connected their experience to hidden patterns in WWII, German soldiers who shielded civilians despite orders, Soviet partisans who helped enemy prisoners escape brutal camps, Japanese nurses who risked execution to smuggle medicines to Allied captives. These stories were often buried because they contradicted the clear lines needed to justify war. Hal and Sato's reunion challenged that simplicity. revealing the war's shadow world, where human instincts battled propaganda, and where moments of mercy flickered like brief constellations in the darkness. In their final years, Hale and Sato often sat together on Hale's porch, sipping tea and watching planes pass overhead. Sometimes Hale would joke that he still didn't understand why Sato had saved him. Sato would smile softly and reply that saving one life was the only victory he ever felt belonged to him. Hale would nod, knowing that no medal, no archive, no military honor could capture the weight of that truth. When Sato passed away quietly at 86, Hale traveled to Japan for the funeral, standing among villagers who had known Sato only as a quiet mechanic. Unaware of the extraordinary story woven into his past, Hal placed a folded map, the same one Sato had given him in the forest decades ago, on the altar. It was fragile now, ink-smudged, edges brittle, but Hale knew it symbolized the path that had led them from enemies to brothers. Years later, when Hal himself neared the end of his life, he told his grandchildren the story not as a tale of war, but as a reminder that even in humanity's darkest moments, some souls refuse to surrender their light. He described the night sky over the Pacific, the lantern glow in the cave, the trembling hands that chose mercy. His voice grew soft as he said that sometimes the greatest battles of the war were fought not between nations but within individual hearts. And so the legacy of the American pilot and the Japanese soldier endured, carried in whispers, preserved in memories, and woven into the quiet truth that history rarely teaches, that even amid intelligence battles, psychological warfare, and secret missions hidden from the world, a single act of compassion can defy the machinery of destruction. Their story lived not because it was dramatic, though it was, nor because it was rare, though it was, but because it revealed a dimension of the war often buried under strategy and statistics. The truth that humanity survives through choices made when no one else is watching. When a man lowers his blade instead of raising it, when mercy becomes stronger than fear,